The first sound is the dry, rhythmic rasping of iron through frozen soil. A single iron-shod spade forcing its way down into earth that has been opened 100 times before. Because in a parish this old, there is no such thing as untouched ground. Every grave is dug through someone. He is the last human hand to touch every soul in the village, and he is the one man no one will touch in return. In the parish registers of 17th century England, his title appears in a plain, unadorned hand, sexton, written beside the tolling of a heavy bell and a fee of 4 pence. He opened the cold earth for the beloved, the outcast, and the forgotten alike. He knew the dead of that village, their names, their faces, the exact weight of their wooden coffins, far more intimately than the priest who stood above the pit and murmured prayers into the wind. But it was not the physical labor of digging that set him apart from the living. It was what the parish secretly believed his calloused hands brought home each night when the sun dipped below the churchyard wall. Tonight, we stay with him, at the edge of the pit, by the frayed bell rope, in the heavy silence between one passing and the next. Welcome, sleepyheads. Wherever you are tonight, whatever time it is where you are, go ahead and draw the blankets up, rest your head against the pillow, and settle in. Tonight, we are stepping into the quiet, shadowed history of a figure everyone needed, but no one wanted to hold a conversation with, the parish gravedigger. For centuries, the gravedigger, or the sexton, stood precisely at the boundary line between the living world and the eternal one. He was the keeper of the churchyard key, the operator of the passing bell, and the quiet custodian of the community's dark, unavoidable reality. He opened the ground for everyone, and no one opened a door for him. He returned each evening to a solitary cottage, leaning against the lichen-crusted churchyard wall, smelling faintly of turned damp earth, wood smoke, and cold tallow, watching the lanterns flicker out across a village that relied on his hands but kept him strictly at a distance. If you find these quiet histories help you drift off, a gentle tap on the like button helps more sleepyheads find their way here. And if you'd like to help someone else find a little rest tonight, that small, quiet gesture is enough. Over the next 2.5 hours, across 10 detailed chapters, we will walk the moss-covered stone paths of the old churchyard together. We will begin in Chapter 1 with the cold, echoing chime of the passing bell, exploring how the sexton was always the very first person in the village to know that a life had ended. In Chapter 2, Digging Through the Dead, we will uncover the forgotten craft of grave reuse, the ancient management of the charnel house, and how centuries of burials were fitted into tiny, crowded plots of parish land. In Chapter 3, How We Know, the parish register, we examine the quiet paper trails, the ledger entries, and the exact fees in pence that give us our historical window into his world. In Chapter 4, The Theology of the Ground, we cross the physical divide between consecrated earth and the dark, unblessed north side of the churchyard, where the sexton was ordered to dig for those whom the church rejected. In Chapter 5, The Economy of Dying, we examine mortality as a business, the precise costs of shroud, bell, depth, and stone at the till of human passing. In Chapter 6, The Outcast's Daily Life, we step inside his cottage by the churchyard wall, observing the empty chair, the quiet tavern, and the social exile of a man who lived perpetually in the shadow of the grave. In Chapter 7, The Hours That Leave No Record, we enter the slow drift of his daily routine, the seasonal rhythms of the soil, the changing autumn frost, and the silent maintenance of the church grounds. In Chapter 8, The Cast of the Necessary But Shunned, we examine the broader historical phenomenon of necessary outcasts, comparing the sexton to the executioner, the leper, and the sin-eater. In Chapter 9, Three Small Mercies, we discover three rare glimpses of quiet human warmth that pierced the loneliness of his solitary office. And finally, in Chapter 10, The Sexton Remembered, we look back at a life written in stone and ink, closing with a profound look at how the man who buried everyone was himself finally laid to rest. We will finish in our soft outro, visiting a quiet modern archive where the sexton's iron tools and handwritten registers still rest today. So let the room go dark. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the quiet rhythm of history carry you into a deep, uninterrupted rest.
In the spring of 1672, in the quiet rural parish of St. Mary at Bures, a farming village nestled in the rolling sheep country along the Essex border, a man named Thomas Jones climbed the worn, winding wooden steps of the church tower long before the morning light had touched the thatched roofs below. A sexton like Thomas, representative of hundreds of parish gravediggers whose names survive today in the margins of yellowed paper registers, carried the quiet weight of the community on his shoulders. In his coat pocket rested a small leather-bound notebook and a brass inkwell. In his hands rested a coarse rope made of hemp, frayed and softened by decades of human palms. Before he picked up his spade, before he took his bread, before he spoke a single word to his family or neighbors, he pulled the rope. Dong. A heavy, low bronze resonance swung out into the cold morning air, rolling over the tiled roofs, drifting down the narrow dirt lanes, passing through glassless windows and waking the sleeping village. Dong. He paused. He counted 3 slow heartbeats in the silence. 1, 2, 3. And then pulled again. 3 clear, distinct strokes. The tellers. In the custom of the English countryside, 3 strokes signaled to the entire parish that a man had passed away in the night. Had it been a woman, the bronze bell would have struck twice. Had it been a child, a single solitary chime would have echoed across the fields. Then came the slow, rhythmic, unhurried tolling. 1 single strike for every year the deceased had walked the earth. 54 strokes. Down in the village, housewives paused with their hearth brooms mid-sweep. Blacksmiths rested their hammers against cold anvils. Laborers in the early mist stopped their oxen at the turn of the furrow. No one had to ask who had died. Everyone in a parish of 400 souls knew who was 54 years old and had been bedridden with the autumn fever. The sexton was the first speaker of truth. Before the priest had put on his vestments, before the clerk had taken up his pen, before the neighbors had gathered at the door with broth and linen, the sexton's bell had already told the story. He was the keeper of the community's mortality, the first person to know that a place at a table had been vacated, that a seat by the hearth was forever cold. To understand the gravedigger is to understand that he did not merely inhabit the churchyard, he inhabited the passage of time itself. The bell rope was the nerve cord of the parish. Through it, the sexton held a strange, quiet monopoly on the news that mattered most. In early modern Europe, from the reign of the Tudors through the late 17th century, the parish was an isolated world. News from the outside kingdom traveled slowly, carried by carters and drovers over rutted mud roads. But local news, the news of life, marriage, and death, was instant, broadcast directly from the church belfry by the sexton's calloused hands.
When the tolling ceased, Thomas Johns let the hemp rope swing gently back to rest against the whitewashed wall of the belfry. He did not rush down the stairs. He descended step by step, his iron-nailed boots clanking softly against the oak treads, smelling of the damp stone, bird-lime, and ancient timber that filled the upper reaches of the tower. At the base of the tower, he opened his ledger. With a goose-feather quill, he recorded the name, the date, and the standard fees drawn from regional parish accounts, a few pence for the tolling of the bell, and a few more for the opening of the earth. He opens the ground for everyone, and no one opens a door for him. From the church door, the walk to the burial plot was never long, but it was a walk taken in a profound, invisible isolation. As Thomas walked through the churchyard gate, carrying his spade over his right shoulder and a wooden measuring rod in his left hand, the village was beginning to stir. Yet as he passed the cottage gates, conversation trailed off. Mothers pulled small children back from the wooden fences, gently folding their aprons over little eyes. Men tilted their hats down, offering a terse, barely perceptible nod, but stepping back onto the grass to let him pass on the narrow gravel track. It was not hatred that kept them at a distance. It was a deep, superstitious dread. In the eyes of the early modern peasant, the sexton was not simply a man performing a necessary public service. He was a man who lived in permanent proximity to the threshold of life and death. His garments carried the faint, lingering smell of the churchyard, a mixture of cold damp, turned clay, and faint mold. His hands had touched the ropes that lowered the wooden chests into the dark earth. To shake his hand was to invite the dampness into one's own home. To invite him to sit by the hearth was to bring the shadow of the churchyard into the living space. The sexton understood this silence. He had grown up with it, or he had inherited the office from a father who had known it before him. He walked with his head slightly bowed, his eyes fixed on the path, his rhythm steady and unhurried. Reaching the selected plot on the south side of the church tower, where the grass grew thick and green under the shadow of a broad yew tree, Thomas laid down his measuring rod. He knelt in the dew-drenched grass. Using the sharp edge of his iron spade, he cut the turf into clean rectangular tiles, lifting them one by one and stacking them neatly to one side. These sods would be replaced at the very end, like a green blanket drawn back over a sleeping child, to make the earth look whole again. As the iron blade sliced through the turf, it made a sharp, tearing sound, the tearing of roots, the parting of living green from the dark, rich soil beneath. Slice, lift, stack. The rhythm was as hypnotic as the bell had been an hour before. Digging a grave was not a matter of mere strength. It was a precise, exacting craft. A grave must be deep enough to deter roaming animals, shallow enough that the sexton could throw the soil out over his shoulder without a scaffold, wide enough to accommodate the rough timber coffin, and straight-sided so the earth would not collapse upon the worker while he stood 6 feet below the surface. As he dug deeper, the air inside the pit grew cold and still. The sounds of the village, the crowing of a rooster, the barking of a farm dog, the clatter of a wooden cart became muffled and distant, filtered through the thick walls of raw earth. Down here, 2 feet below the surface, then 4 feet, then 6 feet, the sexton worked in a private room built of soil and shadow. He was surrounded by the scent of deep earth, a smell that never changes across centuries, damp, heavy, and metallic, filled with the decaying matter of 1,000 forgotten autumns. Down here, the temperature was always constant, cool in the heat of midsummer, protected from the biting wind of midwinter. Every stroke of the spade was a conversation with the past. In a churchyard that had been used for 500 years, no spadeful of earth was ever truly empty. At 3 feet, the iron tip struck something hard with a dull, hollow clack. Thomas did not flinch or shout. He paused, laid down his spade, and knelt in the bottom of the pit. With his bare fingers, he gently brushed away the crumbling brown earth to reveal a fragment of dark oak wood, soft and fibrous with age, and beneath it a smooth, pale curve of bone, the crown of an ancient skull, resting where it had been laid 2 centuries before. He did not treat it with terror, nor with callous disrespect. He lifted the bone quietly, placing it into a wicker basket he kept at the edge of the pit, specifically for this purpose. Later, when the new burial was complete and the soil replaced, these older bones, the charnel, would be laid gently back into the earth above the new coffin, or carried to the crypt beneath the church porch. At the churchyard wall he belongs to the dead, not the living. By noon, the pit was finished. Its sides were carved clean and flat, its floor leveled and smoothed by the flat of his spade. Thomas climbed out using a short wooden ladder, his boots heavy with yellow clay. He stood at the edge, looking down into the neat rectangular void he had created in the middle of the quiet green grass. In a few hours, the funeral procession would arrive. The priest would read the solemn service from his book of common prayer. The mourners would weep and drop sprigs of rosemary on the lowered wood. The family would look at Thomas with a mixture of profound gratitude and sudden cold recoil as he stepped forward with his shovel to fill the hole.
They would leave, returning to the warm, bright light of the village tavern to drink hot ale and share memories of the departed. Thomas would remain behind in the gathering twilight, working alone until the pit was filled, the soil heaped into a neat mound, and the rectangular sods fitted carefully back into place. He would wipe his spade with a handful of dry grass, lock the heavy iron gate of the churchyard behind him, and walk the short, shadowed lane home to a small cottage set directly against the wall, close enough to hear the ancient yew trees shift and sigh in the night wind, far enough that no lamp but his own would be lit to greet him. His pockets were heavier by a few copper pence, his heavy boots caked in damp clay, his heart carrying the silent weight of an office everyone relied upon but no one wished to touch. The village slept easier for his long labor. It simply preferred to not watch him do it. From today's view, it's a grim and lonely, solitary labor performed by an outcast at the fringes of society. From their view, it was a holy, indispensable stewardship of the soul's resting place, binding the living to the dead through the steady rhythm of the spade and the bell. And that's what's so chilling.
In the autumn of 1714, in the ancient parish churchyard of St. Mary Major in Exeter, a sexton named Richard Frost, representative of the parish gravediggers who managed these crowded urban churchyards, stood waist-deep in damp black earth, holding an iron spade with a worn ash handle. The churchyard covered less than half an acre of ground, wedged tightly between timber-framed medieval shops, narrow cobblestone alleys, and the towering stone buttresses of the nearby cathedral. Yet for more than 600 years, every parishioner who had died within those narrow city lanes, tens of thousands of men, women, and children, had been brought through the stone archway to be laid beneath this very turf. The arithmetic of the churchyard was an impossible problem that every sexton had to solve by hand. When a grieving family stood at the churchyard gate, they saw a peaceful lawn carpeted with damp moss, wild clover, and carved slate headstones. But Richard Frost saw what lay beneath, a dense subterranean metropolis of wood, bone, linen, and earth, stacked layer upon layer, until the soil itself had risen several feet above the level of the surrounding street. There was no such thing as fresh ground. Every grave Richard dug was a grave dug through someone else. In the early modern era, parish land was strictly finite, locked within ancient municipal boundaries that could not expand. Yet the dead kept arriving. To manage this relentless influx, European communities developed a complex, highly regulated craft of soil management and bone displacement, a quiet, systematic process known as grave reuse. A plot of consecrated ground was not bought in perpetuity by ordinary parishioners. It was rented for a span of time, typically 10 to 15 years, long enough for the wooden coffin to collapse and the flesh to return to the dust from whence it came. Once that period had elapsed, the sexton's spade would inevitably return to the exact same spot. As Richard Frost drove his spade deep into the loam, the iron edge cut through soft soil before meeting the tough resistance of decayed oak timber. He worked carefully, easing the blade under the wood. With a slow, dull groan, the rotted board broke apart, releasing the sharp, dry scent of aged timber, damp leaf mold, and ancient earth. Crunch, yield, clear. Down at 4 feet, he encountered the physical reality of the parish's long memory. With his gloved hands, he lifted out 3 smoothed leg bones and the heavy, earth-stained vault of a skull, its teeth still perfectly set in the jaw. These were not treated with horror or panic. In the eyes of 17th and 18th century Christians, the physical body was merely an earthly garment, shed at death like a winter coat, awaiting the ultimate resurrection at the end of time. The sexton was the quiet custodian of these shed garments. To accommodate the new corpse, Richard utilized the parish charnel house or the ossuary. In larger town churches, this was a stone-vaulted crypt beneath the church floor, or a low stone building situated in the quietest corner of the graveyard. In smaller rural parishes, it was simply a deep pit lined with dry stone, known as the bone house. With practiced, methodical respect, Richard carried the lifted bones to the charnel vault. Inside, illuminated only by a single tallow candle resting on a stone ledge, thousands of skulls were neatly stacked against the whitewashed stone walls like rounded cobblestones, flanked by long, dense palisades of arm and leg bones. The air in the charnel house was cool, motionless, and completely silent, smelling of dry chalk, lime, and ancient dust. Here, all human distinctions vanished. The skull of the wealthy merchant who had died in a velvet coat rested directly beside the skull of the penniless apprentice who had starved in an attic. In the charnel house, the sexton was the great equalizer of human history. He opens the ground for everyone, and no one opens a door for him. When the new grave was dug to its proper depth, Richard took the older bones he had set aside and arranged them neatly along the bottom of the trench, beneath the level where the new wooden box would rest, or placed them gently on top of the lid once the coffin was lowered. In this way, generations of the same parish were woven together into a dense, continuous tapestry of earth and bone. The physical labor required for this work was immense. A standard grave required the excavation of roughly 90 cubic feet of earth, weighing nearly 2 tons. In the freezing rain of January, the top 6 inches of turf were frozen solid as iron, requiring an iron pick to break through the crust. In the heat of August, the soil dried into a hard, dusty brick that coated the sexton's throat and stung his eyes. Yet the greatest danger was not the weather, it was the structural instability of the ground itself. In a heavily used churchyard, the soil was loose, friable, and honeycombed with old timber cavities where wooden coffins had rotted away decades prior, leaving hidden pockets of empty air behind thin walls of dirt. A sexton working 6 feet down was standing in a narrow chimney of unsettled earth. Every spadeful removed changed the delicate tension holding those ancient, crumbly walls together. Without warning, a pocket of trapped air would give way with a soft, ominous hiss, the sound of fine, dry gravel trickling down between the turf roots, followed instantly by the deep, heavy thud of a shifting wall. If a cave-in collapsed, it did not spill like loose sand. It fell in heavy, solid blocks of damp clay, weighing hundreds of pounds. A cave-in could pin a man's boots, crush his chest against the opposite side of the pit, or bury him alive under 4 feet of suffocating black loam before his spade even hit the grass.
Because he worked alone, with no crew standing at the top of the trench and no one watching from the church porch, a cave-in was often a silent sentence. The earth would simply absorb his cries, deadening the sound of his voice beneath the thick carpet of turf. Experienced sextons developed an extraordinary, almost animal instinct for these invisible warnings. They learned to listen to the soil as if it were a living creature. They knew the difference between the clean, wet slice of healthy clay and the dry, hollow thump that signaled a buried void behind the wall. If the soil smelled suddenly of cold basement air and dry, stagnant dust, or if a single hairline crack appeared along the side of the trench, the sexton did not pause to gather his tools. He jammed his foot onto the ashwood handle of his spade, vaulted upward, and hauled himself out onto the grass seconds before the trench wall folded inward with a heavy, muffled roar, filling the pit with dark, tumbling soil. At the churchyard wall, he belongs to the dead, not the living. By late afternoon, the sun began to sink behind the leaded glass windows of St. Mary Major, casting long purple shadows across the crowded headstones. Richard Frost climbed out of the pit and scraped the dark clay from his boots with a flat piece of slate. He looked back at the open grave. Beneath his feet lay 6 centuries of human grief, love, faith, and memory, compressed into a few feet of dark urban soil. Tomorrow, another family would stand here weeping,
dropping sprigs of rosemary and handfuls of earth into the pit, entirely unaware of the intricate, laborious choreography of bone, soil, and spade that had made room for their sorrow. The living walked upon the surface, holding their breath as they passed the churchyard gate, eager to return to the warmth of their hearths, their shops, and their daily lives. But Richard Frost remained behind, in the dim light, leaning on his ash-handled spade, the quiet master of an underground world that never stopped growing. From today's view, it's a grotesque disturbance of the dead, bordering on desecration. From their view, it was an essential, deeply organized economy of sacred space, ensuring that every soul, regardless of status or wealth, was granted a physical resting place within the protective shadow of the church. And that's what's so chilling.
In the dark, stone-walled vestry of a country church like St. Mary's in Hawkhurst, Kent, a heavy oak chest sat beneath a narrow leaded window. Reinforced with thick iron straps and secured by 3 separate brass locks, it was designed so that no single man could open it alone. One key was held by the rector, and the other 2 by the parish churchwardens. Only when all 3 men stood together in the cold damp of the vestry could the heavy wooden lid be lifted to reveal what lay within. Rectangular books bound in stiff calfskin and thick pigskin paper. These were the parish registers, the cold, ink-stained paper trail that records the rhythm of human life and death across 3 centuries of English history. If you turn those heavy, yellowed pages today, past the elegant, flowing script of the village rector and the precise, formal entries of the parish clerk, you will occasionally come across a different hand. It is a heavier hand, written with a cheaper gall ink that has faded over time to a soft reddish brown. The letters are thick, slightly clumsy, and unadorned, the writing of a man whose fingers were far more accustomed to gripping the wooden shaft of an iron spade than balancing a delicate goose quill. This was the record of the sexton. To understand how we know the dark reality of the gravedigger's life, we must turn to these quiet, surviving archives. The sexton was rarely written about in the grand histories of kings, battles, and parliamentary debates. He belonged to a quiet, subterranean caste of historical figures whose existence was captured almost entirely through administrative necessity and financial accounting. We know him not because he wrote memoirs or kept personal diaries, but because every spadeful of earth he turned, every bronze toll of the bell he delivered, and every copper coin he received was meticulously recorded in parish ledgers. In 1538, Thomas Cromwell, Vicar General to Henry VIII, issued a royal injunction mandating that every parish church in England must purchase a secure chest and maintain a weekly register of every baptism, marriage, and burial performed within its boundaries. It was a monumental shift in state administration, the birth of modern record-keeping. The crown required 3 locks precisely to prevent fraud, alteration, or secret burials. The state, for the first time, demanded an accurate count of its souls. And at the local level, that heavy administrative burden fell squarely upon the church officers. For the sexton, the parish register was his bill of work, his receipts of labor, and his primary proof of employment. In vestry ledgers and churchwardens' accounts from the 16th through the 18th centuries, the sexton's fees appear with remarkable clinical consistency. While the rector received his tithes from wheat, wool, and livestock, the sexton was paid directly from the pockets of grieving families or from the parish pauper box when a pauper died without a farthing to his name.
The fee schedules preserved in these parish books reveal a strict, highly detailed financial hierarchy of mortality. In early modern England, parish records fees ran on a precise, practical scale. For ringing the small bell, 2 pence. For tolling the great bell for an adult, 4 pence. For opening the earth in the church aisle, 6 pence. For opening the earth inside the church aisle, 2 shillings.
These figures reflected the physical labor, time, and social standing associated with each aspect of burial. A grave inside the church itself, reserved for wealthy landowners, merchants, and clergy, demanded the heavy labor of lifting stone flagstones, digging through centuries of lime mortar, and carefully resetting the slate floor, earning the sexton a far higher sum than a simple pit beneath the grass outside. Beyond financial ledgers, the parish registers also preserve the quiet, extraordinary observations of men who stood on the front lines of historical tragedy. When bad harvests, harsh winters, or contagious fevers swept through a village, the parish clerk and the sexton recorded the sudden, terrifying acceleration of their daily routine. During hard seasons, such as the brutal winter of 1683, when the River Thames froze solid to its bed, the entries in surviving parish registers tell a story that goes beyond simple names and dates. Where a normal month might see 2 or 3 burials recorded in a neat, spaced hand, the pages from those bitter months become crammed with dense, frantic columns of names filling the paper edge to edge. The ink grows darker and blotchier as the sexton worked late into the night by candlelight to keep up with his entries. In the margins, small, terse notes appear beside the names. Buried in the cold frost, died of the purple fever, or simply a poor stranger found by the wayside. The sexton was the parish's silent demographer. He knew before anyone else when a season was turning deadly. He saw the pattern in the earth long before the magistrate or the village doctor recognized the spread of an epidemic. Each new name in his book represented another hole he had dug in the frozen clay, another rope pulled in the belfry, another family standing silently in the wind as he filled the pit. He opens the ground for everyone, and no one opens a door for him. Yet the parish registers also record the fragile, human vulnerabilities of the sexton's own office. Because his pay was modest and tied entirely to the number of deaths in the parish, many sextons lived perpetually on the edge of poverty. In churchwardens' accounts, we find frequent records of small loans and disbursements granted to sextons, payments for a new pair of heavy leather boots to withstand the wet clay, timber to repair a leaky cottage roof, or small charitable relief allowances during unusually long, healthy summers when burials were few and fees were lean. In the quiet months of late spring, when the earth dried and fewer burials occurred, the sexton's ledger often lay shut for weeks at a time. During these long stretches of lean income, he performed odd maintenance jobs around the church property, mending the wooden parish bier used to carry coffins, sweeping the stone aisles, oiling the iron hinges of the church door, or whitewashing the interior walls, each task recorded with meticulous care in the churchwarden's ledger for a few extra pence. In more than one surviving parish book from the early 18th century, a sexton's own family appears in the very ledgers he maintained. In these rare, quiet entries, a sexton's hand falters, the ink is slightly smudged, and the letters trail off precariously. Below his usual neat entry for a parishioner's burial, he records the death of his own child, noted in a stark, simple line that stands without elaboration. Grave dug by her father.
It is in these quiet, unvarnished administrative traces that the true reality of the gravedigger emerges. He was not a theatrical monster of folklore or a Gothic caricature lurking in the fog. He was a working man, a craftsman of the soil, bound by royal statutes, church canons, and precise financial fees, carrying out an indispensable public duty day after day, year after year. The parchment pages kept in those iron-bound oak chests have outlasted the timber coffins he lowered into the earth, the leather boots he wore, and the iron spades he wielded until his hands grew too stiff to hold the handle. The living who once shrank from his presence in the village lanes have long since vanished into the dark loam he managed. At the churchyard wall, he belongs to the dead, not the living. When an archivist or a historian lifts one of those heavy calfskin volumes today in a quiet county record office, turning the brittle yellowed leaves under soft lighting, they're touching the exact paper that sat upon the sexton's rough wooden table 300 years ago. Each page turns with a dry, crisp rustle, like dried autumn leaves underfoot. The faint smell of aged leather, dried gall ink, and historic dust still clings to the parchment, a quiet, enduring echo of the man who held the ledger, pulled the bell rope, and recorded the final chapter of every life in the parish. From today's view, it's a dry and clinical record of administrative routine buried in dusty archives. From their view, it was the official, solemn ledger of human existence, ensuring that no soul, no matter how humble or poor, slipped out of this world without their name being written into the permanent memory of the parish. And that's what's so chilling.
In the late autumn of 1689, in the coastal parish of St. Michael at Workington in Cumberland, a sexton named William Hayton, representative of the parishmen who knew every acre of ground the living preferred not to name, walked past the sunlit south porch of the church and stepped into the perpetual shadow of the church's northern wall. In his left hand he carried a heavy iron spade. Under his arm he held a simple wooden stake carved from unseasoned ash. The grass beneath his leather boots was damp, thick, and rank, choked with coarse nettles, creeping ivy, and wild hemlock. While the southern side of the churchyard was neat, well-maintained, and bathed in the warm light of the midday sun, the northern side was cold, silent, and visually neglected. William had been ordered by the parish authorities to dig a grave here, in the soil that the village quietly called the wrong side of the church. To understand the daily work of the sexton, one must understand that a churchyard was not merely a plot of grass. It was a physical map of Christian theology, social status, and spiritual geography. The ground was divided into strict, invisible zones of sanctity. Where a person was buried and how their grave was oriented was believed to directly affect their soul's journey on the day of final judgment. The south side of the churchyard, warmed by the sun and visible to every parishioner walking through the main stone porch on Sunday morning, was the most coveted ground. Here rested the respectable, the pious, and those who could afford the higher parish fees. The wealthy gentry, churchwardens, and prosperous yeomen competed for plots closest to the south door or directly under the shadow of the chancel wall. To be laid to rest on the south side was to remain visible in the community's collective memory every week as the congregation assembled for prayer. Furthermore, every grave on the south side was aligned with meticulous astronomical care. The body was laid in the earth with its feet toward the east and its head toward the west. The theological reasoning was precise.
When the archangel's trumpet sounded at the end of time, the Christian dead would rise facing the dawn, ready to meet the Eastern return of Christ. The north side was an entirely different world. In popular European tradition and medieval church lore, the north was associated with cold winds, spiritual darkness, and the demonic realm. Because the massive stone nave of the church blocked the southern sun, the northern grass remained damp, mossy, and shaded throughout the year. It was the land of the excluded, the tragic, and the condemned. The ecclesiastical law was precise about who belonged in this shadowed earth. Under the strict canons of the early modern Church of England and broader European tradition, Christian burial in consecrated soil was a privilege, not an automatic right. Those who died outside the full communion of the Church were denied burial in the sunny south yard.
This included 4 distinct groups whose deaths posed profound theological problems for the parish: those who had taken their own lives, unbaptized infants, executed criminals or excommunicated individuals, and unidentified strangers who perished within the parish bounds. For those who died by suicide, considered a severe crime against both God and the Crown, the law was historically severe. Outside the churchyard entirely, older and harsher customs sought to fix the dead at a lonely crossroads outside the village boundaries. But when the local magistrate or coroner granted a rare decree of leniency, declaring the individual non compos mentis, or not of sound mind, the body was permitted within the churchyard walls, but strictly restricted to the unblessed northern verge. For unbaptized infants, the theological status was equally delicate. Having died before receiving the sacrament of holy baptism, they carried the weight of original sin and could not be laid among the baptized dead on the south side. Executed criminals, excommunicates, and unknown travelers drowned in the river or found frozen in the hedgerows were similarly relegated to the northern shade, buried without the usual church honors, away from the gaze of the living. On this cold autumn afternoon, William Hayton pressed his spade into the thick, dark sod of the northern border. The soil here felt noticeably different from the south yard. Because it was rarely turned and never fertilized with light and sun, the ground was heavy, sour, and packed with clay that clung stubbornly to the iron blade. Squelch, lift, throw. There were no flowers planted here, no slate headstones carved with pious verses or winged cherubs. The graves on the north side were marked, if at all, by simple field stones, wooden crosses, or humble mounds of turf that soon sank back into the surrounding weeds. The timing of these northern burials reflected the community's desire for quiet concealment. While a Southside burial was a public event, accompanied by the full tolling of the great bell, a procession of mourners, and a solemn service read by the rector in his white surplice, a northern burial was performed in near total silence. The body was brought through the churchyard gate quietly, under the veil of dusk or early mist, carried on a simple wooden bier by a few tight-lipped relatives who kept their eyes fixed firmly on the grass. There was often no tolling of the bell, no full liturgy, and no gathering of the village. The priest might read a brief, truncated prayer at the edge of the pit, or stand at a distance in quiet contemplation while William worked alone with his spade. The sexton was the sole executor of this quiet marginalization. He was the one who threw the heavy, damp clay onto the lid. He was the one who drove the wooden marker into the turf. He was the one who smoothed the sour earth over a life that the parish wished to forget.
He opens the ground for everyone, and no one opens a door for him. Yet the sexton's work on the north side revealed a deep, quiet paradox in his profession. To the village, he was the agent of official judgment, executing the cold decrees of church law and social stigma. But in the privacy of the shadow, working alone with his spade, many sextons displayed a quiet, pragmatic humanity that softened the cruelty of the law. Historical church accounts and parish registers show that sextons frequently buried unbaptized infants just inches inside the consecrated boundary, placing them as close as possible to the shadow of the chancel wall, so that rainwater dripping from the church roof, blessed by its contact with the holy building, might fall upon their graves like a late natural baptism. In doing so, the sexton offered the grieving parents a fragile thread of spiritual comfort that official doctrine withheld. Sextons knew the personal tragedies behind every entry in the book. They knew the young mother who had lost her mind to puerpero fever. They knew the desperate laborer who had walked into the mill pond after his crop failed. They knew the abandoned infant found wrapped in rags beside the church stile. When William Hayton filled the pit on the north side that autumn evening, he did not throw the earth down with anger or contempt. He handled the sour clay with the same practiced, steady care he gave to the richest squire in the parish. He leveled the turf, smoothed the edges with the back of his shovel, and laid a single piece of slate over the mound to keep the heavy winter rains from washing the earth away. At the churchyard wall, he belongs to the dead, not the living. As the dusk deepened and the cold mist began to roll off the Irish Sea, wrapping the stone tower of St. Michael's in a pale gray shroud, William picked up his tools and walked out of the northern shadow. Behind him lay a quiet row of sunken mounds, hidden in the long grass, silent testimony to the rigid boundaries that governed early modern life and death. The living built high walls between the righteous and the sinner, the blessed and the cursed, the central aisle and the northern shade. But beneath the surface, 6 feet down into the dark clay, those boundaries dissolved into the same cool earth. The spade made no distinction between the soil of the south and the clay of the north. It simply opened the ground, received the weight, and closed the earth until the end of days. From today's view, it's a cruel and superstitious segregation of human grief, enforcing religious dogma beyond the grave. From their view, it was a necessary and sacred maintenance of moral order, preserving the holiness of consecrated ground while extending a cold, precise mercy to those on the fringes. And that's what's so chilling. In the freezing January of 1732, in the market parish of St. Peter in Leeds, a sexton named Edward Briggs, representative of the parish officials who stood at the financial till of human passing, sat by a small tallow lamp in the vestry office, dipping a goose-feather quill into dark ink. Across the heavy oak table sat a widowed wool weaver named John Hargreaves, one of thousands who sat across that table to bargain for a resting place. The air in the room was thick with the scent of damp wool, tallow smoke, and the faint, bitter frost drifting through the door. John's wife had died 2 nights prior after a long chest illness, and he had come to arrange the price of her burial. John laid a small, coarse linen pouch onto the wood. Inside were 5 silver shillings and a handful of worn copper halfpence, the total savings of 2 years at the loom. Clink, count, record. Edward Briggs did not count the money with malice, nor with dramatic greed. He counted it with the cold, practiced precision of a merchant weighing grain. Every step of leaving this world carried an exact, itemized cost, and the sexton was the officer who collected the toll at the gate. To understand the dark reality of the gravedigger's world, one must realize that in early modern Europe, dying was an expensive transaction. Long before the modern funeral industry emerged with its polished caskets and mahogany hearses, the parish church maintained an absolute legal monopoly on mortality. Every ritual, every bell strike, every foot of soil, and every piece of linen had a price fixed by parish custom and churchwarden decree. For the poor and working families of the 18th century, a death in the house was not only a profound emotional tragedy, it was a financial catastrophe that could plunge a household into debt for years. The transaction began at the church belfry. In financial scales preserved in parish accounts across northern England, the tolling of the passing bell was charged by the duration and by the weight of the bronze. A family with only a few copper pence received the short toll of the small bell. If they paid a higher fee, the sexton sounded the great tenor bell, whose deep booming chime carried for miles across the valley, announcing to every surrounding village that a person of substance had passed away. Sound itself was a commodity, purchased in increments of copper. Next came the physical depth of the grave. The ordinary parish fee covered an ordinary depth of 4 to 5 feet, but if a family feared grave disturbances or wished to place multiple relatives in a single family plot over time, they paid the sexton an extra fee for every additional foot of soil excavated. A deep grave of 8 or 10 feet required double the physical labor, and Edward Briggs charged accordingly, as the extra depth ensured protection for the coffin beneath layers of dense clay. Then came the shroud and the coffin. Under the Woolen Acts passed by the English Parliament in the late 17th century, designed to protect the domestic wool trade, it was a legal requirement that every corpse be wrapped in a shroud made entirely of sheep's wool rather than imported linen, unless a heavy fine was paid to the parish poor box. The sexton often held the parish supply of these coarse woolen sheets, selling them directly to grieving families at the church door. If the family was too poor to afford a wooden coffin, the deceased was carried to the churchyard on the parish bier, a reusable wooden stretcher wrapped only in a woolen shroud. The body was lowered into the bare clay, and the reusable wooden box or cloth was carried back to the church porch to await the next pauper. Edward Briggs recorded each item in his ledger as John watched in silence. A fee for the bell, a fee for the depth of 6 feet, the cost of the mandated woolen shroud, and the sexton's fee for lowering the body into the earth. When the total was calculated, it consumed several weeks of a weaver's wages. John handed over the coins, his calloused hands trembling slightly against the cold table, leaving himself with barely enough copper to buy bread for his children. The sexton swept the coins into a wooden, iron-bound box. The money gathered in that box was not merely personal income, it funded the parish infrastructure. A large portion went to the rector for the spiritual service, another portion went to the church wardens to repair the stone roof, oil the clockwork, and maintain the churchyard wall, while a small fixed percentage remained with Edward as his personal wage. This created a strange, morally complex dynamic at the heart of the sexton's life. The gravedigger was the only man in the village whose livelihood depended entirely upon the mortality of his neighbors. The seasonality of death shaped his personal household budget with cruel predictability. A long, mild summer with few fevers and no epidemics meant empty graves, empty rescue ropes, and weeks of empty ledger pages in July, leaving the sexton with an empty bread box at home. But a harsh winter of freezing frost, influenza, or smallpox brought immense human suffering to the parish, crowding the ledger columns in February and filling the sexton's pockets with coin. He opens the ground for everyone, and no one opens a door for him. Yet the financial system was not entirely without a safety valve. The same system that extracted fees from John also maintained a quiet circular loop of parish charity. When a pauper died with no family and no money whatsoever, the parish church wardens drew 3 or 4 pence directly from the poor box, funded in part from the fees of wealthier burials, to pay Edward for a basic pit on the northern edge of the churchyard and a single bell toll. In these pauper burials, the sexton worked quickly and without ceremony, but historical records show that many sextons quietly provided small unbilled mercies, laying a few sprigs of evergreen or rosemary in the bare dirt, or carefully replacing the turf so the rain would not wash the shallow soil away. As the late afternoon sun faded behind the stone mills of Leeds, Edward Briggs closed his ledger and locked the money box into the iron chest. He walked out into the freezing churchyard carrying his lantern and his iron spade. In the dim yellow light, he began to dig the grave for John's wife. The ground was hard as stone at the surface, requiring the heavy iron pick to break through the frost. With every blow of the iron, sparks flew into the cold twilight air. Clang, crack, scoop.
Edward worked steadily through the evening, his breath blooming in white clouds against the darkness. Down at 6 feet, the air grew still, cold and quiet. Up above, the chimney smoke from the village cottages drifted over the stone wall, carrying the smell of burning peat and roasting meat. The living were sitting down to their evening meals, counting their coins, warming their hands by the hearth, and planning for tomorrow. Down in the pit, Edward Briggs stood surrounded by 6 feet of dark, frozen earth, leaning on his spade, holding the gold and copper of the parish's sorrow, yet returned to an empty hearth at the edge of the grounds. He was the quiet administrator of the final ledger, the man who ensured that every soul paid their final earthly debt before being handed over to the quiet eternity of the ground. At the churchyard wall, he belongs to the dead, not the living. From today's view, it's a cold and mercenary exploitation of human grief, putting a price tag on mortality. From their view, it was an essential, highly organized economic system that maintained the sacred order of the parish, ensuring that every burial was accounted for, recorded, and paid in full. And that's what's so chilling.
The first sound inside the cottage was the soft, dry drop of an iron latch falling home into its keeper. Latch, step, stillness. It was a small, 2-room dwelling built directly against the northern stone wall of the churchyard, a cottage in an English parish of the later 17th century, like the ones occupied by sextons like John Cooper, representative of the village gravediggers who lived in the narrow space where the village ended and the graves began. The air in the room was cool, heavy, and still, thick with the scent of damp wool hung over a wooden rail, dried heather, peat smoke, and the faint, cold smell of turned clay that never quite left his coat. Through the thin, whitewashed plaster of the back wall, he could hear the night wind rustling through the heavy yew branches outside, a low, continuous sigh that sounded like distant water. In the parish, this was the only doorway where the latch was dropped from the inside and where no uninvited foot ever crossed the threshold. Every morning began with a quiet, solitary ritual among the tools resting by the door. Long before the village awoke, the sexton stepped onto the cold clay floor, checking his equipment with the methodical care of a craftsman whose work was conducted entirely in isolation. He tested the edge of his iron spade with the thumb of his leather glove, ensured the brass joints of his measuring rod were greased with lard against the damp, and wiped the glass panes of his lantern.
He oiled the heavy iron key that unlocked the churchyard gate, its rasping turn in the lock being the only sound to greet him in the early gray light. In the parish, this was the only doorway where the latch was dropped from the inside and where no uninvited foot ever crossed the threshold. Every morning began with a quiet, solitary ritual among the tools resting by the door. Long before the village awoke, the sexton stepped onto the cold clay floor, checking his equipment with the methodical care of a craftsman whose work was conducted entirely in isolation. He tested the edge of his iron spade with the thumb of his leather glove, ensured the brass joints of his measuring rod were greased with lard against the damp, and wiped the glass panes of his lantern. He oiled the heavy iron key that unlocked the churchyard gate, its rasping turn in the lock being the only sound to greet him in the early gray light. In the parish, this was the only doorway where the latch was dropped from the inside and where no uninvited foot ever crossed the threshold. In the main room, near the hearth, stood a single wooden chair with a high, straight back, its oak arms smoothed by years of his calloused palms. Opposite it, across a low table cut from coarse pine, was an empty space. A second chair was neither needed nor kept. A single pewter cup sat beside a wooden bowl, a single iron fork rested on a stone ledge, a single pair of heavy mud-crusted boots stood by the hearth to dry before the glowing peat. On the wall hung the tools of his office, arranged in order: the iron-shod spade, its ash handle rubbed smooth with tallow, the short wooden measuring rod marked in feet and inches, the brass lantern with its horn panes clouded by smoke, and the heavy iron key. These were his daily companions. They sat by his fire while the rest of the parish gathered in the bright, noisy comfort of the village tavern 200 yards down the road.
When the sexton walked through the village on a market day in the border country, his presence created a quiet, invisible eddy in the human tide. As he moved down the narrow dirt lane, carrying a bundle of straw or a bucket of tallow, conversation did not stop with a crash, but it withered at the edges. Women carrying baskets of eggs or salted fish gently folded their aprons, stepped off the gravel track onto the soft grass, and drew their small children back against the wooden fences until he had passed. Men, leaning against the smithy wall, offered a brief, silent tilt of their hats, a nod of recognition that carried no invitation to linger or converse, stepping back just enough to avoid the brush of his heavy wool coat as his boots turned early down the side path. It was not anger that pushed him to the margins, nor was it a personal grievance against the man himself. It was a deep, quiet dread of the invisible boundary he represented. In the popular mind of early modern England, the sexton was a living threshold, a man who spent his days touching the cold linen, the rotted oak, and the damp earth of the grave. To touch his hand in greeting, to sit beside him on a tavern bench, or to share a cup of ale from the same pewter pitcher, was believed to invite the shadow of the churchyard into one's own blood and home. Custom dictated that a cup once used by the grave tender at an inn was often set aside or washed separately in boiling lye, framed not as malicious cruelty, but as a quiet, superstitious precaution against the cold contagion the living believed he carried in the folds of his coat. The local tavern was the true heart of the parish's social life, the place where carters, weavers, and farmers gathered in the evening to warm themselves by a roaring log fire, swap stories of the harvest, and drink dark, malty ale. But the tavern door was an invisible barrier the sexton rarely crossed. When he did step inside to purchase a small stone jug of beer to carry home, a subtle hush fell over the room. The laughter that had filled the space grew thin and tentative. Men shifted on their wooden benches, drawing their coats closer to their chests. The tavern keeper slid the jug across the wooden counter without letting his fingers touch the sexton's hand, lifting the copper pence from the bar only after the door had clicked shut behind him. The sexton did not argue or protest. He gathered his jug, stepped back out into the cold night air, and walked the quiet lane back toward the churchyard wall, leaving the warm light and the muffled voices behind him. His daily life was governed by an erratic, unpredictable rhythm, a cycle of intense, exhausting labor, followed by long, hollow stretches of waiting. During a mild summer, when no fevers swept the lanes and the parish remained healthy, days or even weeks could pass without the tolling of the bell.
In those quiet hours, the job became a prison of stillness. Without burials to dig, his pockets held only the sparse pence left over from last month's work. He passed the long afternoons walking the perimeter of the churchyard wall, pulling weeds from the base of the stone markers, scraping moss from the slate slabs, mending the wooden bier, or sitting alone on the church porch, watching the shadows shift across the grass. He counted the long days since the last bell had rung, his isolation deepening in the quiet sunshine. The silence during these healthy weeks was thick and heavy, while the rest of the village worked together in the hayfields, singing, calling across the rows, sharing water jugs under the noon sun. The sexton worked alone in a landscape of quiet stone and rustling yews, surrounded by thousands of silent parishioner names that only he remembered. The job gave him his daily bread, but it demanded his complete removal from the community of the living. As the sun dipped behind the western hills, casting long, dark shadows across the damp grass, the sexton returned to his small cottage against the wall. He kindled a small fire of peat and dry brush, watching the pale blue smoke rise through the stone chimney into the darkening sky. He sat down in his single wooden chair, taking up a small piece of tallow and a rag to clean the rust from his spade. The iron blade glided over the ash wood with a soft, rhythmic shuck-shuck, a dry, comforting sound that filled the quiet room. Outside, his only true neighbors, the dark yew trees, the night frost creeping over the stone wall, and the barn owls nesting in the belfry, kept watch over the dark grounds. The yew branches shifted in the rising night wind, their dark needles scraping softly against the exterior plaster of his wall. The church clock in the stone tower above struck 8 slow, heavy notes, the sound vibrating down through the masonry into the timber frame of his cottage. Down in the village, lamps were extinguished one by one as families went to their rest, safe in the warm comfort of shared rooms and familiar voices. The sexton remained at his table, watching the single rushlight gutter and dim in its holder, dropping small beads of hot wax onto the coarse wood. He opens the ground for everyone, and no one opens a door for him. He was the guardian of the final secret, the man who held the keys to the earth, the one who stayed behind when every tear had been dried and every mourner had walked home to their hearth. He lived in the space between the living world and the silent eternity beneath the grass, tethered to both, yet belonging fully to neither.
At the churchyard wall, he belongs to the dead, not the living. He blew out the flickering rushlight, leaving the room illuminated only by the faint, deep red glow of the dying peat embers.
He lay down upon his narrow straw bed, listening to the owl call from the belfry and the wind sigh through the tall grass beyond the wall, drifting off into the same deep, unbroken quiet that he preserved for the entire parish, night after night. From today's view, it's a cold social exile dressed up as custom, treating an essential worker like a living curse. From their view, it was a necessary distance, a sacred boundary designed to protect the fragile light of the living from the cold, creeping contagion of the grave. And that's what's so chilling. The first sound of the morning was the sharp, metallic bite of iron scraping against a rim of white frost. Scrape, sweep, set. It was a cold, quiet Tuesday in late October in an English parish near the Sussex Downs, where a sexton named Henry Gable, representative of the parish gravediggers whose ordinary Tuesdays survive nowhere but in the shape of the ground they kept, lifted the latch of the churchyard gate. The iron ring was cold enough to stick slightly to his bare palm. When the oak gate swung open on its iron hinges, it made no sound, its pintles recently oiled with sheep fat. Before him lay half an acre of wet turf, slate headstones, and ancient yew trees, shrouded in a low sea fog that drifted over the churchyard wall from the southern hills. Most of what Henry Gable did with his life would never be written in the parish registers, recorded in the churchwarden's accounts, or remembered by the men and women who passed his wall each day. The history books preserve the moments of crisis, the great fever years, the frozen winters, the long funeral processions, and the precise payments of copper and silver for the ringing of the bell. But between those rare recorded markers lay thousands of quiet, unrecorded hours, a lifetime measured not in deaths or dollars, but in the slow, rhythmic maintenance of 4 walls, a stone porch, and a field of grass. His day began with the morning round. Before he touched a spade or picked up a tool, Henry walked the gravel paths that crisscrossed the churchyard. He walked with a slow, deliberate stride, his eyes trained on the ground. He noticed what the night had left behind, a heavy bough broken from the ancient yew tree by the autumn wind, a row of loose gravel kicked into the grass by stray sheep that had breached the lower stile, a slate headboard leaning slightly out of plumb after 3 days of rain, a scatter of dry oak leaves choking the stone drain near the vestry door. This was work that required no order from the rector and no vote from the vestry meeting. It was the silent daily stewardship of a sacred space, a routine as unhurried and continuous as the changing of the tide. He carried a small bundle of tools in a wicker basket, a short, stiff broom made of birch twigs, a wooden mallet, a small iron trowel, a horn of lard, and a ball of coarse hemp twine. At the south porch, the stone archway through which every bride, infant, and coffin entered the church, he spent 20 minutes sweeping the flagged floor. The birch broom made a soft whispering sound against the worn limestone, clearing away the dry mud tracked in by Sunday's congregation, the cobwebs from the carved oak joists, and the chaff blown in from the nearby threshing floors.
Whisper, sweep, clear. From the porch, he moved to the church building itself. He checked the low wooden door that led to the belfry tower, applying a dab of sheep fat to the iron latch so that it would lift without a rasp when the passing bell was next required. He stepped inside the cool, dark stone chamber at the base of the tower, where the air smelled of damp lime, ancient oak timber, and dry bird droppings. He reached up to check the heavy hemp bell rope where it passed through the wooden ceiling. He ran his thumb along the fibers, feeling for any fraying or wear where the rope met the iron wheel 40 feet above in the darkness. Satisfied, he stepped back out into the pale morning light, locking the heavy door behind him. In the corner of the churchyard, under the lean-to shed built against the stone wall, sat the parish bier, the long, low wooden frame with 4 handles used to carry coffins from the parish boundary to the open grave. Henry turned the bier over, inspecting the ash rails for split wood or rot, wiping down the frame with an oiled rag to preserve the timber against the relentless English damp. None of this labor earned a fee. No entry in the parish ledger noted that on a foggy October morning, the sexton spent 2 hours mending a wooden rail, sweeping stone porch steps, and scaring rooks away from a newly sodded mound. These were the hours that vanished into the landscape, leaving no paper trail behind. To understand the sexton's life, one must understand how his body inhabited the long, slow cycle of the soil across 4 seasons of the year. In the spring, when the long rains softened the earth, the work of the spade was smooth and pliable. The thaw mud lifted easily from the blade, smelling of fresh grass roots, wet clay, and turning earth. It was the season of repair. Henry spent his spring days relaying the green sods over the winter graves, tamping down the soil that had settled during the January thaws, and trimming the rank grass that sprouted around the bases of the slate markers. The green returned unevenly across the churchyard. Last winter's new graves showed as dark, rich rectangles of raw earth before the clover and wild grass took hold once more. By midsummer, the character of the soil underwent a profound transformation. Under the hot June sun, the heavy clay dried into a dense, unyielding crust as hard as baked brick. A spade thrown against midsummer earth bounced off with a dull ringing strike, requiring the heavy iron pick to break the surface before any trench could be formed. During these warm, healthy weeks, when fevers were rare and the bell hung silent in the tower for half a month at a time, the churchyard became a place of dry, sunlit stillness. The air smelled of drying grass, wild thyme, and warm stone. The long summer dusk stretched on until 9 at night, casting long purple shadows from the yew trees across the turf.
In these long, quiet afternoons, Henry sat on the stone bench inside the church porch, carving a replacement peg for the bier, or watching the swallows swoop in and out of the belfry louvers. The village was a distant hum beyond the wall, the clatter of a cart on the high road, the muffled calling of haymakers in the meadow, the faint ring of the blacksmith's anvil 2 fields away. He was surrounded by life, yet entirely removed from its bustle, sitting quietly among those who no longer spoke. He opens the ground for everyone, and no one opens a door for him. Autumn brought the leaf mulch and the return of the rain. The oak and yew leaves fell in heavy, sodden blankets, burying the paths and filling the sunken graves with damp, brown decay. Henry worked with his rake and broom, gathering the leaves into great baskets to be stacked against the northern wall to rot into dark soil. The air grew sharp with the smell of wood smoke drifting from village chimneys and the bitter metallic scent of wet wool from his coat as the October mists rolled in. Then came the winter, the true test of the sexton's strength. When the hard frost settled over the Sussex Downs, the top 6 inches of turf froze solid as iron. Digging a grave in January was a grueling negotiation with the elements. Before a spade could bite into the clay, Henry had to lay a fire of dry brush and coal over the marked plot, letting the embers burn for 3 hours to thaw the frozen crust beneath. He worked in the freezing dark of early morning, his breath blooming in pale white clouds against the black yews, his iron pick striking sparks against the flintstones buried in the soil. Yet even in the depth of winter, when the earth was bitter and resistant, he worked with the same steady cadence he maintained in June. The soul of the sexton's life resided in those long, ordinary afternoons when absolutely nothing happened. Consider a Thursday in late November. The sky is a flat, uniform gray, heavy with unfallen rain. The last funeral was 6 days ago. The next may not come for a week. There is no bell to ring, no ledger to sign, no family standing at the gate, no fee to collect in copper or silver. Henry stands by the eastern wall, leaning on his rake, watching 3 blackbirds forage in the damp soil of a 2-year-old grave. A cold breeze rustles through the dry nettles along the northern verge. Across the road, the windows of the village cottages show small flickering yellow points of candlelight as the early twilight settles in. He hears a door slam in the village, the sharp bark of a sheepdog, the laughter of children running home from the schoolhouse. He does not move. He is part of the architecture of the grounds, as permanent and unmoving as the stone buttresses of the aisle and the ancient yew that has stood beside the porch for 400 years. He walks to the edge of a grave he dug 5 years before. The turf has healed completely. The mound has settled flat. The slate stone has taken on a quiet coat of pale green lichen. The family who wept here has moved on, their grief softened by the passage of seasons. Only the sexton remembers the exact depth of the trench, the weight of the oak box, and the cold rain that fell that afternoon, and the precise sound the wet clay made as it hit the lid. He holds the memory of the ground in his muscles and mind, keeping a private, unwritten map of everything that lies beneath the surface. At the churchyard wall, he belongs to the dead, not the living. As the dusk deepens into night, the sea fog grows thicker, wrapping the church tower in a dense, ghost-white mantle. The distant sheep cough in the mist beyond the stone wall. Henry gathers his broom, his rake, and his oil horn, placing them neatly back into the lean-to shed. He checks the iron latch of the churchyard gate one last time, ensuring the oak frame rests snugly against the post. He does not look back at the dark windows of the village tavern, nor does he look for a lamp lit in a window to greet him. He steps through the side postern gate, locking it with a familiar, heavy click of the iron key, and turns toward his solitary cottage against the wall. The day's unrecorded work is done. The paths are clear, the stone porch is swept, the bell rope is checked, the turf is settled, and the quiet boundary between the living and the eternal has been maintained for another 12 hours without a single word written in a book. From today's view, it's an empty, unrecorded existence spent entirely on labor that vanished without a trace. From their view, it was the essential, quiet stewardship of a sacred sanctuary, ensuring that the boundary between the living and the eternal remained ordered, clean, and undisturbed. And that's what's so chilling.
The first image was a wooden coin tray left resting on the flat top of a stone boundary wall. Step, space, silence. In the quiet twilight of an early modern parish, money changed hands without palms ever meeting. The silver coin was dropped into a shallow pewter bowl filled with cloudy vinegar to cleanse the metal, or laid flat upon a cold slate slab embedded in the churchyard mortar.
The buyer stepped back 3 paces into the gravel road. The man on the other side stepped forward, gathered the coin, and left his goods or his labor behind. It was a cold, silent choreography of transaction, a gesture repeated across centuries for men and women who held the most essential, uncomfortable positions in human society. Across early modern Europe, the shapes of these transaction customs rhymed, even when local statutes and municipal laws did not match. The sexton was not an isolated anomaly of a single English parish, nor was his lonely cottage by the wall an accidental creation of one village's prejudice. He belonged to a quiet, subterranean caste of historical figures who spanned empires, centuries, and cultures, the necessary but shunned. These were the men and women required by the community to perform the vital infrastructure of judgment, mortality, and disease, the individuals who took upon their own shoulders the physical and spiritual dirt of civilization, so that the rest of the parish could live in clean, unbroken order. Society built a high, invisible wall between itself and those who handled its ultimate thresholds. They were paid from the public chest, housed at the parish expense, and relied upon in every season of crisis. Yet they were kept strictly at arm's length. The shared logic of their exile was remarkably consistent. Contact with death, contact with legal judgment, or contact with physical decay was believed in custom, if not always in statute, to leave a lingering, invisible stain, a contamination that no amount of clean water or honest labor could wash away. Consider the executioner. Across early modern European towns, the man who held the sword or adjusted the rope occupied a position of absolute legal necessity. The court pronounced the sentence, the magistrate signed the parchment, and the priest offered the final prayers, but it was the executioner's hand that fulfilled the cold mandate of the law. Without him, the entire judicial authority of the state would stall at the foot of the scaffold. Yet the moment his work was done, the town turned its back. He lived in an isolated cottage set at the very edge of the town wall, near the gallows or the tanner's pits where the foulest trades were banished. When he walked through the market square on a busy afternoon, an unpaid nod was the only greeting he received from the townspeople. A bench at the inn was left vacant the moment he approached, and his money was dropped into a wooden bowl with lye rather than handed directly to the merchant. The hand that held the iron blade of the law was a hand no neighbor would shake in the marketplace, a hand that no father wished to see offered to his daughter in marriage.
His isolation was not a punishment for a crime he committed. It was the social price of performing a duty the community demanded but refused to see or touch. The town needed its peace kept and its laws executed, but it demanded that the executioner carry the moral weight of the blood alone. A similar geometry of distance governed the life of the leper and those who dwelt at the edges of the medieval and early modern lazaretto. The individual afflicted with a body the parish treated as a living boundary was not merely a patient suffering a physical illness. They were viewed as a walking reminder of mortality and divine judgment. The community provided for them through charitable endowments, leaving wicker baskets of bread, salted fish, and clean linen on top of stone walls set along the high road outside the town gates. They gave from a distance, relying on the dry clack of wooden rattles or the chime of small handbells to signal from afar where the afflicted might gather their relief. The distance was framed as public health and spiritual precaution, an invisible moat dug between the healthy center and the contaminated margin, ensuring that charity was delivered without the danger of physical contact. To cross that boundary without the bell ringing was to breach the sacred barrier that kept the healthy village safe from the shadow of decay.
In surviving accounts and later folklore along the Welsh borders, a similar social logic created the figure of the sin eater. In rural parishes where a neighbor died suddenly without the church's final rites, a solitary man living at the margin of the parish might be brought to the edge of the death house. He was paid a few copper pence to consume a crust of bread and a bowl of ale over the deceased, taking upon himself what the family feared still clung to the departed soul. For that service, gratitude arrived mixed with immediate dread. The family needed his intervention to clear their path, yet as soon as the copper was paid, he was ushered away from the threshold, viewed with cold recoil for carrying what they had hired him to take away. He returned to his hut at the edge of the commons, carrying the coins in his pouch and the dark superstitions of the parish on his back. When we return to the parish sexton, we see the daily, unvarnished expression of this exact same historical pattern. He was less dramatic than the executioner on his scaffold, less visually marked than the leper at the stone cross, and less folkloric than the sin-eater at the threshold. He was simply the ordinary, everyday version of the threshold keeper. He opens the ground for everyone, and no one opens a door for him. Every Tuesday, while other men plowed fields, wove cloth, or traded wool at the market cross, the sexton performed the quiet, necessary mechanics of mortality. He was the man who turned the soil when the fever struck, who lifted the heavy oak boxes into the dark earth, who managed the crowded charnel house beneath the aisle, and who tolled the bronze bell that told the village who had left the earth.
He lived in the small cottage abutting the churchyard wall, close enough to serve the church at a moment's notice, far enough that his daily life did not spill over into the parish lane. His neighbors relied upon his spade to keep their village sanitary and sacred, yet they looked away when he passed their gates, stepping off the path so that his heavy wool coat would not brush against their aprons. The sexton was the permanent anchor of this outcast caste. The hangman worked only on court days. The sin-eater was summoned only in moments of sudden, unblessed death. The leper-keeper watched the road from his distant hospital, but the sexton was there every single morning. He swept the porch, oiled the gates, checked the ropes, and dug through the ancient bone and clay, day after day, year after year. He held the keys to the parish's private resting place, yet he remained an eternal stranger in the very village he served. Civilization has always created these quiet, necessary outcasts. It builds its cities, its courts, its markets, and its churches, and then it hires a few solitary hands to manage the dark, difficult edges that make those bright spaces possible. The executioner cleanses the law. The leper-keeper holds the disease outside the gate. The sin-eater absorbs the dark transgressions of the dead, and the sexton manages the cold, inevitable end of every human story. They form an unbroken chain of boundary workers across human history, bound together by the same cold logic of utility and exclusion. The tragedy of their office was not that they were forgotten, but that they were remembered only as symbols of the very things the living wished to deny. The village demanded that someone open the earth, handle the bone, and ring the passing bell, but it could never quite forgive the man who held the spade for reminding them that the ground was waiting for everyone. At the churchyard wall, he belongs to the dead, not the living. The sun sets over the parish lanes, casting long purple shadows across the slate headstones and the quiet gravel tracks. Down in the village, the lanterns are lit in warm kitchens, and families gather around their hearths to break bread, safe in the comfort of shared shelter and familiar voices. At the edge of the grounds, the sexton sits alone by his small peat fire, watching the red embers glow in the dark, listening to the wind sighing through the ancient yew trees beyond his wall. The road outside his door is empty, quiet, and still, a threshold held straight and true by a man who stays behind so that others may rest in peace. He sets his pewter mug upon the coarse pine table, closes his iron-bound ledger, and listens to the night wind rustle the heavy grass over 100 quiet graves. He knows that when tomorrow comes, he will step out with his spade once more, continuing the ancient, silent work that holds the living world together. From today's view, it's a cruel caste system that scapegoated essential workers for handling the hard truths of life. From their view, it was a vital system of spiritual and social hygiene, a way to keep the center of village life clean and unbroken by pushing the heavy work of mortality onto a few necessary hands. And that's what's so chilling.
The first sound was a name, spoken softly across the damp turf of the churchyard at twilight. Name, pause, thanks. In the ordinary rhythm of a parish day, words addressed to the sexton were terse, functional, and clipped. He was called sexton, or gravedigger, or addressed with a brief mandatory nod from the parish gate. But when a word was spoken that belonged to the man rather than the office, a Christian name released into the cool air without hesitation, it cut through the quiet isolation of his work like a warm lamp brought into an unlit vault. For all the closed doors, the empty lanes, and the careful distances recorded in the memory of early modern English parishes, the history of the churchyard is not entirely a history of cold exile. In the grain of surviving custom, parish recollections, and the subtle traces left behind by men like John Cooper, representative of the parish gravediggers, whose ordinary loneliness was only rarely interrupted, there exist rare, quiet moments where the social boundary dissolved. These were not grand events that made the newspapers or changed the laws of the realm. They were small, fleeting mercies, human gestures that cost nothing to give, yet carried an extraordinary weight to a man who lived perpetually in the shadow of the grave. The first mercy belonged to a widow named Margaret, standing beside a freshly filled mound on a gray autumn evening. The funeral procession had long since departed for the village. The priest had closed his book and returned to his study. The mourners had walked back to the tavern to drink warm ale and share memories of the dead. Only the widow remained behind, her black wool shawl drawn tight against the rising sea fog, watching John Cooper smooth the final rectangular sods over her husband's resting place. John worked with his usual steady, unhurried care. He tamped down the green tiles with the flat of his spade, trimmed the loose edges of clay with his pocket knife, and brushed away the loose earth that had spilled onto the gravel path. When the task was complete, he wiped his iron blade with a handful of dry grass and stepped back, his eyes fixed respectfully on the ground, waiting for her to turn and leave. She did not turn away. She stepped forward across the wet grass, stepping closer than custom usually allowed, and looked directly into his face. She did not reach into her purse for a coin, nor did she speak of the parish fees her family had already paid at the vestry door. She simply reached beneath her shawl, placed a small, warm loaf of barley bread, wrapped in a clean linen cloth, into her calloused hands, and spoke 2 quiet words. "Thank you, John." It was not sexton. It was not a title or an administrative role. It was his name, the name his mother had called him, the name written 40 years before in the baptismal register on the other side of the stone porch.
For a brief, suspended second, the heavy architecture of social distance collapsed. She did not look at his hands as instruments of contamination, nor did she recoil from the faint smell of turned earth that clung to his coat. She recognized the man beneath the spade, the quiet craftsman who had held her sorrow with care when no one else was watching. She turned and walked down the path, her boots making a soft, rhythmic crunch on the gravel. John stood alone under the darkening yew, holding the warm loaf against his chest, the simple sound of his own name echoing softly in the quiet churchyard air. The second mercy arrived on a bright, wind-swept morning in early June, brought by a child who had not yet learned the careful, superstitious fears of the adult world. John was kneeling near the south porch, using a small iron scraper to clean the green moss from the base of an old slate headstone. A 7-year-old boy, the son of a local blacksmith, had wandered away from his mother while she traded wool at the village stile. The boy walked slowly across the grass, his scuffed leather shoes kicking at the dandelion clocks, until he stood 3 paces from where John was working. In the ordinary course of parish life, an adult who saw a child near the gravedigger would have called out sharply, pulled the child back by the sleeve, and hurried them away with a hushed warning about the damp and the dark. But on this morning the mother was occupied at the market cross, and the boy remained where he was, watching John's hands with quiet, unhurried curiosity. He did not see a living curse, or a man who carried the shadow of the grave. He saw a man working with iron and stone, a craftsman doing something real, precise, and interesting with his hands. "Does the stone hurt when you scrape it?" the boy asked, his voice clear and untroubled in the quiet morning light. John paused, his iron scraper held still against the slate. He did not step back, nor did he offer the gruff, distant warning that custom usually demanded of him. He looked up at the boy, his weathered face softening at the corners. "No, young master," John replied quietly, his voice low and raspy from disuse. "The stone doesn't feel a thing. It just likes to have its face washed, so the letters stay clean for the sunshine." The boy nodded slowly, accepting the answer with the profound, unquestioning gravity of childhood. He stepped an inch closer, pointing his small finger at the carved cherub on the slate. "I can read the letter A," the boy offered proudly. "A fine letter," John said, offering a small, barely visible nod, "the best one to start with." They stayed like that for 2 full minutes, a solitary gravedigger and a blacksmith's son, sharing a quiet moment of uncomplicated human company over a piece of carved slate. There was no fear, no recoil, and no suspicion. When the mother's voice finally called from the churchyard gate, the boy did not run away in panic. He simply turned, offered a quick wave of his small hand, and called back over his shoulder, "Good day, Master Sexton," before trotting off across the grass.
John watched him go, then turned back to his work. The scraper moved against the slate with a lighter, smoother rhythm. The cold isolation of his office had not been erased, but for 2 minutes the boundary wall had been no higher than a dandelion stem. The third mercy occurred on a freezing afternoon in late January, on the wooden bench that sat inside the stone porch of the church. The winter wind was howling across the downs, driving a thin, needle-sharp sleet against the leaded glass windows of the nave. John had been working since dawn, trying to break through 4 inches of frozen crust on the northern border, his hands stiff and red despite his heavy wool mittens. He had stepped into the porch to seek shelter from the sleet, sitting down on the long oak bench to blow on his fingers and catch his breath.
A few moments later, the church door opened with a heavy wooden thud. The parish rector, an elderly, soft-spoken man named Reverend Thomas, stepped out into the porch, wrapping his dark wool cloak tighter round his shoulders. In many parishes, the relationship between the rector and the sexton was strictly hierarchical and administrative. The rector gave the orders, signed the registers, and collected the higher tithes, while the sexton performed the manual labor and waited at a respectful distance in the rain. But on this bitter January afternoon, Reverend Thomas did not remain standing, nor did he deliver a brief formal instruction about tomorrow's burial. He walked over to the wooden bench, cleared a small space of dry leaves with the hem of his cloak, and sat down directly beside the gravedigger. They sat shoulder to shoulder on the same oak plank, two elderly men seeking refuge from the same winter storm. The rector did not launch into a sermon about resurrection, nor did he attempt to offer grand theological explanations for the hardship of the season. He reached into the folds of his cloak, produced a small pewter flask filled with warm spiced ale, unscrewed the top, and passed it directly to John. "It's a bitter wind today, John," the priest said quietly, his breath forming a small white cloud in the cold air of the porch. "Aye, sir," John replied, taking the flask with a nod of quiet gratitude. "The ground is like iron beneath the turf." "It will yield eventually," the rector said softly. "It always does." They sat together in complete silence for 10 minutes, listening to the sleet rattle against the stone archway and watching the gray mist roll over the churchyard wall. There was no lecture, no performance of piety, and no insistence on the distance between the altar and the grave. It was simply two men sharing the warmth of a bench, a flask of ale, and the quiet dignity of a shared sanctuary. When the storm began to ease, the rector stood up, patted John once on the shoulder, a brief warm touch that carried no fear of contamination, and stepped out into the lane toward his vicarage.
These three small mercies, a widow's thanks, a child's fearless gaze, and a priest's shared bench, did not permanently dismantle the social architecture of the parish. They did not erase the cold logic of the fee books, nor did they open the doors of the village tavern to the sexton when evening fell. On the following market day, women would still draw their aprons close as John passed, and men would still step off the narrow path to let him go by. These gestures were exceptions, not the rule. But that is precisely why they mattered so profoundly. They were rare, spontaneous breaches in an otherwise rigid wall, proof that beneath the heavy weight of custom, superstition, and social fear, the quiet thread of human empathy never completely snapped. They made the cold isolation of the office bearable, providing a small reservoir of warmth that a man could carry home to his solitary cottage against the churchyard wall. He opens the ground for everyone, and no one opens a door for him. That larger, inescapable truth remained as real on Sunday as it was on Tuesday. The sexton would always be the man who stayed behind when the service was over, the one who held the key, the one who worked in the cold clay while others sat by warm hearths. At the churchyard wall, he belongs to the dead, not the living. The evening light fades slowly over the Sussex hills, casting a pale violet glow across the silent churchyard. The wind dies down to a soft whisper in the upper boughs of the yew. John Cooper steps into his small cottage, sets his iron spade by the hearth, and kindles his small peat fire.
he breaks the widow's loaf upon his pine table, feeling the quiet memory of the day's warmth rest upon his shoulders like a wool blanket. Outside his window, the churchyard rests in deep, unbroken peace, held safe through the night by a man who knows that even in the coldest landscape, grace can find a way across the wall. From today's view, it's three small proofs that human kindness could still pierce the heaviest social exile. From their view, each mercy was a quiet, extraordinary risk, a step across a sacred boundary toward a man the parish had agreed to keep at the edge. And that's what's so chilling.
The first sound was the sharp, dry scratch of a goose quill writing a single line across a fresh page in the vestry book. Ink, stone, quiet. The hand holding the pen was not the heavy, awkward hand that had kept the parish records for 40 years. It was the smooth, fluid hand of the parish clerk, writing with a fresh batch of black gall ink under the pale morning light of the vestry window. The letters formed a name, an age, a date, and a quiet 4-word note in the margin that marked the end of an era for the entire community. For 40 years, sexton. He was a man like John Cooper, representative of the parish gravediggers whose names survive more often in a single register line than in any story the living told about them. He had reached the end of a long, solitary life spent in the quiet service of the churchyard wall. The office of the sexton ended the only way parish offices ever end. Not with a grand public assembly, not with speeches from the vestry steps, and not with the tolling of bells across the county. It ended in the quiet, unhurried space of a single room, when the body grew too weary to lift the heavy iron spade, when the hands could no longer hold the hemp bell rope, and when the cold winter damp finally settled deep into old bones that had spent 4 decades standing in 6 feet of wet clay. His tools remained where he had left them on his final evening, the ash-handled spade leaning against the hearth, its iron blade wiped clean and greased with lard, the brass horn lantern sitting on the pine table beside his single pewter cup, and the heavy iron key to the churchyard gate resting on its iron nail by the door, waiting for a hand that would not return to lift it. When the man who had buried everyone in the parish finally passed away, the village faced a quiet, practical dilemma that every community eventually had to solve. Who digs for the digger? In the early modern English parish, the work of mortality could not pause because the keeper of the ground had died. The churchyard remained open, the bell still needed pulling, the turf still needed turning. To open the earth for the sexton, the parish churchwardens pressed a young laborer into service, often a farmer's son or a local carpenter's apprentice who knew the feel of a shovel, or an assistant who had walked the churchyard paths beside the old man during the heavy fever winters. This new worker walked through the iron gate carrying an unfamiliar spade, stepping into the footprints the old sexton had left behind in the damp gravel path. He stood on the south side of the church tower, under the shadow of the same ancient yew tree where the old man had worked for half a century, and drove his iron blade deep into the turf. Slice, lift, stack. The sound of the spade cutting through the grass was the same sound the old man had made 10,000 times before. The iron edge sliced through the sods. The heavy clay was thrown up over the edge of the pit. The air inside the trench grew cold, damp, and still, smelling of turned roots and ancient leaf mold. The young laborer worked carefully, feeling the sudden strange gravity of his task. He was digging a room in the earth for the man who had built every other room in the parish churchyard. On a quiet, overcast Thursday afternoon, the burial of the man who had buried everyone took place under the gray skies of the Sussex Downs. The funeral procession was not a grand display of public grief, nor was it a noisy gathering of the market crowd. The social distance that had defined his living days did not magically dissolve into a flood of tears when his heart ceased to beat. Custom and habit were far too deep for dramatic reversals. Yet the burial was conducted with a quiet, dignified reverence that reflected the unspoken debt the parish owed to his hands. A small gathering stood at the edge of the open pit, the parish rector in his white linen surplice holding the Book of Common Prayer, the church wardens with their wooden staves, a few elderly neighbors who remembered his work during the hard frost years, and the widow Margaret, wrapped in her dark wool shawl, watching in silence from the shade of the yew. There was a soft, brief echo of the mercies he had received in life, the quiet presence of people who recognized that the man going into the earth had held the sorrow of 400 families with dignity and care. The rector read the solemn service for the burial of the dead, his voice clear and resonant in the cold churchyard air. The wooden coffin, made of plain parish oak, was lowered into the pit using the very hemp ropes the old man had checked and greased 6 weeks before. When the time came to drop the traditional 3 handfuls of earth onto the wood, the rector did not delegate the task. He picked up a handful of yellow clay from the heap, dropped it into the pit, and spoke the ancient words into the silence. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The sound of the clay hitting the oak lid was a soft, heavy thud, a sound the old man had heard from above 10,000 times, now received from below in the darkness of his own resting place. He opens the ground for everyone, and no one opens a door for him. That long central paradox of his life reached its final quiet resolution at the edge of the pit. For 40 years he had been the man who stood outside, the outcast who opened the earth for the beloved and the despised alike, while the living kept their doors shut against his touch. But in the end, the ground made no distinctions. The earth that he had managed for 2 generations opened its arms to receive its own keeper, granting him the exact same sacred rest he had prepared for every soul in the parish.
The living, who had stepped off the path when his wool coat brushed past, now stood in silence at his grave, watching the young laborer fill the trench, heap the soil into a neat mound, and replace the green rectangular sods over his chest. They walked back to their warm kitchens, their shops, and their daily lives, leaving him behind in the quiet soil he had tended for a lifetime. At the churchyard wall, he belongs to the dead, not the living. His belonging was now complete. He lay among the thousands he had buried, the wealthy squires on the sunlit south side, the paupers in their shallow plots, the children under the drip of the eaves, and the outcasts on the northern verge. He was no longer the living threshold, the outcast at the gate, or the man who walked alone down the village lane. He was a permanent resident of the parish's quiet metropolis of stone and bone. What remained of his 4 decades of labor was preserved not in grand monuments, but in 2 quiet, enduring proof objects, a line of ink in a leather register, and a modest stone set in the grass. In the parish register, bound in calfskin and locked inside the iron-strapped chest in the vestry, his entry stood recorded for the future. While kings and generals were remembered in bronze statues, the sexton's life was anchored in the official paper memory of the state. Anyone turning those brittle yellowed pages 300 years later would find his name written in clean black gall ink, a permanent record ensuring that the man who had recorded every passing soul was himself written into the eternal memory of the parish. Beside his grave, near the northern wall he had walked so many thousands of times, the church wardens placed a simple, low slate headboard paid for from the parish poor box. It bore no elaborate winged cherubs or lengthy Latin eulogies, only his name, his age, the year of his passing, and 2 carved crossed spades above his name, the solemn emblem of his craft. Over the decades that followed, the green moss would creep into the carved letters, and the slate would take on a coat of pale lichen. The living who had known his face would pass away. The young laborer who had dug his grave would grow old and be laid to rest nearby. The village would change its roads, its roofs, and its ways. Yet the stone and the ink remained. Remembered did not mean the village had loved him with sudden affection, nor did it mean that social exile was a mistake they admitted aloud. It meant something far more profound and enduring. The record refused total erasure. The parish had required his hands, and when his work was done, it ensured that his name was preserved in stone and paper for as long as the church tower stood against the sky. He had spent his life holding the boundary straight, keeping the paths clear, the ropes oiled, the graves dug, and the bell tolled, so that the living could walk through their short days without fear. He was the quiet administrator of human passing, the craftsman of the soil, the keeper of the churchyard wall.
The sun sinks slowly behind the Sussex hills, casting long purple shadows across the quiet grass. The wind dies down to a soft, barely audible whisper in the dark branches of the ancient yew tree. The young laborer has locked the heavy iron gate, carried the key back to its nail in the cottage, and walked home to his hearth. The churchyard rests in complete, unbroken stillness. The slate headstone stands straight in the grass, its carved crossed spades catching the last faint glow of the evening light. The man who opened the ground for everyone rests securely beneath the turf, his long labor finished, his solitary watch ended, sleeping in the very earth he kept so well for so many years. From today's view, it's the quietest possible justice, a man the living kept at the edge, finally kept by the record. From their view, it was only the last duty of a Christian parish to open the ground one more time for the hand that had opened it for everyone else. And that's what's so chilling. If you walk today through an old parish churchyard in Sussex or Kent, where the stones of the nave have stood for 700 years, and the ancient yew still stretches its dark boughs over the southern porch, the world feels remarkably still. Page, stone, breath. The gravel path beneath your feet is damp with rain, giving off the same sharp scent of wet limestone, crushed flint, and turned earth that greeted the parish sexton 3 centuries ago. The long rows of slate and sandstone headstones lean softly into the grass at different angles, their carved winged cherubs, hourglasses, and crossed spades half filled with pale green lichen and golden moss. The village beyond the stone wall has changed its roofs, its roads, and its speech, but here, inside the perimeter, time moves at the slow, unhurried pace of the soil. If you leave the quiet churchyard and travel a few miles down the road to a county record office, such as the Sussex Record Office in Chichester or the Kent Archives in Maidstone, you enter a different kind of quiet. Inside the climate-controlled reading room, under the soft, diffused glow of overhead lighting, the air smells faintly of dried paper, calfskin binding, and historic dust. Here, resting upon a green velvet foam support on a wooden reading desk, sits one of the original parish registers preserved from the later 17th century. To touch that calfskin cover today, or to watch an archivist gently turn its brittle pigskin pages, is to realize how thin the curtain between past and present truly is. The heavy paper rustles with a dry, whispery sound under the quiet light. Past the flowing, elegant script of the rector and the formal Latinized entries of the parish clerk, the ink changes. You find the heavier, unadorned lines written with cheap iron gall ink that has faded over 300 years to a dark, reddish-brown rust. You are looking at the exact ink applied by a sexton's calloused hand on a cold Tuesday evening after the spade had been wiped clean and the churchyard gate locked for the night. The ink has outlasted the wool shrouds, the rough oak coffins, the leather boots, and the iron spades. It has outlasted the cold social exile, the empty tavern benches, the quiet fears of the marketplace, and the long, unrecorded hours spent sweeping the stone porch in the autumn mist. In these quiet volumes, preserved in county archives across England, the record refused the total erasure that custom once threatened. The man who was kept at the margin in life was given a permanent, unshakable home in the written memory of the state. The physical emblems of his world remained scattered across the landscape like quiet fragments of a long finished song. In small parish churches, the heavy bronze bell still hangs in the dark tower above, its iron clapper still resting against the rim, waiting for a hand to pull the hemp rope that hangs through the floorboards. Under the lean-to roof of a country porch, an old wooden bier still rests against the stone wall, its timber darkened by age and smooth to the touch.
And in the grass near the northern wall, where the shadow of the nave falls coldest in December, a low slate stone sits half buried in nettles, its carved crossed spades still catching the low rays of the setting sun. He opens the ground for everyone, and no one opens a door for him. That ancient, solitary labor is done. The pits have all been filled, the turf has all been replaced, the long ledger of the parish has been closed and placed inside the iron-bound chest. The man who held the key, the spade, and the bell rope has long since taken his place among the thousands he buried, resting securely beneath the grass he tended so well. At the churchyard wall, he belongs to the dead, not the living. Now, as the night deepens around you, you can let the weight of that old world go. The cold rain on the packed clay, the heavy iron latches, the dark yews in the wind, and the solitary cottage against the wall fades softly into the distance. Your room is dark, cool, and still. The air around you is soft and quiet. You do not have to hold the gate, check the ropes, or watch the path. The long history of the soil is settled. The record is safe in the quiet vault, and the churchyard rests in deep, unbroken peace. You can let your shoulders rest heavy against the bed. You can let your breath slow to a calm, easy rhythm, in and out,
quiet and deep as the dark carries you away from the spade, the bell, and the wall into a long, uninterrupted sleep. From today's view, it's a quiet paper trail and a stone the grass has almost finished claiming, enough to prove a necessary life was lived at the edge of the living. From their view, it was simply the last order of a faithful parish to put the man of the wall into the wall's own keeping. And that's what's so chilling.